This lecture will be a brief introduction to algorithms and also some ideas about efficiency and data structures. I'm going to talk a bit about what are algorithms, defining the term and giving you a more intuitive notion of what algorithms are. And then we're going to look at different types of problems and how we can think of algorithms to solve those problems. And also a bit of a concern that is actually very important in practice is the efficiency or the performance of our algorithms, because we need to use them, and if they take too long to run or require too many resources, then we cannot use them at all. And so related to that, I'm going to talk a bit about data structures too, but this will be just a general introduction to things that we are going to be detailing along the course when we focus on specific algorithms. So what are algorithms? When we want to explain to someone how to solve a problem, we need to specify the steps to solve a problem. For example, one way of computing the square root of a number is to pick some value smaller than that number. So we pick value y smaller than the number x for which we want to compute the square root. And now we can compute the value of x divided by y. Because if y is larger than the square root of x, then when we divide x by y, we get a number that is smaller than the square root of x. This is because the square root of x multiplied by the square root of x must be equal to x. So in this way, regardless of our initial guess y, between y and x divided by y, we must have the square root of x. Because if this is larger, then the other one is smaller than the square root, and vice versa. If y is smaller than the square root of x, then x divided by y is larger than the square root of x. So now if we compute the mean point between y and x divided by y, that is the average of the two, we now have a y value that is closer to the square root of x. And now we can repeat these steps, these two steps here, until we get close enough to the square root. So this would be one way of explaining to someone how to compute the square root of a number. Just pick a smaller number, compute the original number divided by that guess, and then compute the average and keep updating the guess as many times as necessary. The problem with this description is that we cannot give it to a computer, because we cannot tell the computer to just pick some value. The computer would have to decide on the value, or to do something until it's close enough. The computer cannot understand what we want, cannot think about things, cannot decide, so we cannot leave anything in our specification of the procedure that requires understanding, decision, thought. So the idea is that an algorithm is a set of steps, a set of rules that define these operations precisely so that they are effective and definite. This means basically that they produce some result and that they can be executed without any reasoning, without any understanding or thought. So everything is detailed and specified so that there is no thinking required to execute that procedure. This would be an example of implementing this root computation algorithm in Python. I'm not presuming that you know Python already. You're going to learn Python during the next few weeks, starting to learn these things, but this is fairly easy to understand. We are defining a function here so that we can call this recipe whenever we want. And the recipe is the number that we receive, x. We're going to divide it by 2 and store the result here in our guess for the root. And now we're going to repeat 5 times. So this range 5 gives us 5 iterations of this for loop. And for each iteration, we're going to compute the average between our guess and x divided by our guess. And we're going to put the result back into our guess root. After we do this 5 times, we return the result. So in this case, we solved those problems of picking a small value or doing enough times or something like that, which were vague and would require the person executing the algorithm to think about things. So that would not really be an algorithm. And we replaced those with specific instructions that do not require any thought. So the computer can now execute this, and it starts by guessing the root to be half the number we input. So if we want to compute, for example, the square root of 10, it will start by guessing the number 5, and then it will repeat this 5 times, and each time it will update the value of the guess until it gets to a value that is very close to the square root of 10. So in this example, if we compute the square root of 10 and then compute the square of that value, we get something that is very, very close to 10. So this, at least for 10, is a good approximation, and the big advantage is that specifying the algorithm in this way, we have everything precisely defined, so that's why this is an algorithm, and so the computer can execute it. The computer does not need to understand anything here. Even these names, root, approximate root, and so on, are just for our benefit when we read the code. The computer does not understand what they mean, but the computer can execute all these steps. So this is what is an algorithm. Is any procedure that we specify with the sufficient detail that allows it to be executed without any decision or thought. So in this way, we can put it in the computer, and the computer can compute the result. Of course, strictly speaking, to be an algorithm, it also must have a finite number of steps. Otherwise, it will not finish, although it's always a problem to prove whether or not some specification actually finishes in a finite number of steps. We're generally not going to be concerned about that in this course, although, as I'm going to talk a bit further on, we will be concerned with the practical aspects of the efficiency of the algorithm and if it gives us a result in useful time. So we don't want to wait years or decades for the result of an algorithm. Okay, the important thing here is that the algorithm must specify exactly what is to be done, and there is no need for understanding. The computer does not have to understand what we want to achieve. And this makes specifying algorithms very different from explaining to someone, to a person, what we want to do. Because we have to be able to specify exactly all the steps to a machine that will not understand what we want, will not do things intelligently, but will just do exactly what we are telling it to do. And this required some skills that may be a bit peculiar, but that we're going to try to practice during this course so that you become a bit more comfortable with this type of computational thinking. So one important skill is the skill to decompose problems into smaller problems in such a way that when we solve the smaller problems, we can fit the procedures together and use that to solve the original problem. So we need to break down a realistic problem into sub-problems and then probably break down those sub-problems into smaller problems yet until we can figure out how to solve each part of the original problem. And then we need to do it in a way that we can fit everything together to solve the original problem. This is decomposition, and it's necessary because for any realistic problem, the number of steps and details that we need to specify tend to be too many for us to keep in our minds while, for example, writing the code or trying to figure out how to solve the problem. So in order to be able to do that, we need to break things down into smaller bits, solve those, and then take advantage of those solutions, reuse those solutions, and fit them together to solve the original problem. Another important skill is abstraction. It is often the case that the algorithm that we need, the procedure that we need to think of, is not dependent on many details of the actual problem. For example, if we want to sort DNA sequences by length, or we want to sort proteins by mass or something like that, all of these in abstract are just sorting problems. So it's just a problem of sorting a set of values. It doesn't matter if the values are the number of nucleotides or the mass in kilodalton or something like that. So abstracting these fundamental aspects of the algorithm from the details of the problem is very important, not only to allow us to think about the algorithms, but also to be able to use the solutions that we already have. So if we already have a sorting algorithm, we don't need to write a new one just because we are now sorting DNA sequences instead of proteins by mass, for example. A bit related to abstraction, but not quite the same, is pattern recognition. If we are capable of abstracting what is important from individual problems, this usually helps us identify similar patterns. But pattern recognition is a bit different from abstraction because it can apply to parts or aspects of algorithms that we already used. For example, the algorithm we saw before for calculating the square root of a number takes advantage of the fact that our estimated root and the original number divided by the estimated root bracket the real root. So the real root must be somewhere between this value and this value here. So as we keep updating with the average between the two, we are narrowing down the range where the real root can be found. This same pattern, this same approach can be used in other problems. For example, if we want to find the zero of a continuous function. Suppose that we have a continuous function and we start with a value of x here in a1 and here in b1. And we know that the function at b1 is negative and the function at a1 is positive. So since the function is continuous, there must be a zero somewhere between a1 and b1. So by using the same kind of approach, where we know that the solution we want is within these brackets, these extremities, we can now compute the midpoint, for example, this b2 point here, and check which of these two intervals has a sign change between the extremities. So these two have the same sign, are both negatives. We discard this part and we focus on this part here. So now we narrowed down the range inside which the zero must be found, and now we compute a new midpoint here, we narrow down again, and we keep doing that. So you see, this algorithm is similar to the one we used for the finding the square root. It's not exactly the same, but the pattern is very similar. And once we recognize these patterns, we can apply the same kind of solutions to different problems. So these kinds of skills are not trivial to acquire. It can take some practice, but one of the goals in this course is to help you get started acquiring these skills so that not only you can understand some basic algorithms used in bioinformatics, but also you learn to think algorithmically, think computationally in order to help you in the future solve problems when you need to think about the algorithms to solve them. So different problems that may arise when we want to solve them with algorithms. One common situation, which is the one in which most naturally we think about the algorithm and try to implement them, is when we know exactly what we want to do, and those are the things that the computer can do. So we can do it with an algorithm that we can implement in the computer. For example, suppose that we want to select from a database of sequences those sequences that will be amplified if we use a given pair of primers. We are thinking about amplification with this polymerase chain reaction, and just to remind you of what it is, we use cycles of denaturation and annealing to separate the DNA strands, and then anneal them with the primers, these small sequences that will give the starting point for the polymerase to build, to extend the chain and create copies of some region of the DNA that we have there. So in order to find out if a given sequence in our database can be amplified with the two primers that we have, we can do this by, for each sequence, computing the reverse complement, which will be the complement of the sequence, but in the reverse order, and then checking if we have one primer matching a part of one sequence and the other primer in the correct region of the reverse complement. So we can verify this, and if this matches, then this particular sequence in our database would be amplified if we were to do PCR on that sequence. So this is an example where we know what we want and we can think of the algorithm and we can actually implement it exactly as we want it. There are other kinds of problems that we're going to see in the course in more detail, but where we know what we want, we have some scientific model of what we want to do because of the way we understand reality, but this is not something that can be computed with the resources that we have. And so in that case, we need to implement something that approximates what we would like. For example, in multiple sequence alignment, we want to align a set of several sequences in a way that in each column we have the residue that is homologous during evolution. This would be the ideal. So this means that this column marked orange here, for example, the residue here is descended from the common ancestor of all these sequences, and it's always in this position. It may suffer some mutations, but it's always in this position here, and the same for this blue region and so on. However, we cannot really do this for several reasons. For example, we do not know exactly what are the evolutionary relations between parts of the sequences, because all we have are the modern sequences and we no longer have the ancestral sequences to examine. So what we can do is align sequences by similarity, which is close to what we want, because in theory, the more homologous and more related they are, the more closely related they are, the more similar they will be. However, similarity and evolutionary proximity is not quite the same thing. So we are using one thing that we can measure, which is the similarity between the sequences that exist today, as an approximation of something that we would like to use, which is the actual evolutionary relation between parts of those sequences. In addition, in this particular problem of multiple sequence alignment, we have a computational issue here, which is the more sequences we have, trying to align them all at the same time, the more the computations become harder, and the difficulty here grows exponentially. So with a large number of sequences, we cannot really guarantee that we can find the optimum alignment in a useful time frame. So we need to use algorithms that try to take shortcuts and find something close to optimal with no guarantee, but that can do it with in a useful time limit. So for several reasons, computational limitation, lack of information, and so on, it sometimes happens that what we can put the computer doing is not exactly what we would like to achieve in theory. But at least in these cases, we know how to specify the rules and tell the computer to do something that is close to what we would like to obtain. In some cases, we don't even have that. For example, consider the problem of predicting genes from a whole genome sequence. Along the genome, we will have parts that are not translated, we will have parts that are junk or leftover viruses or things like that, and then we will have sequences that control which genes are used by each cell, for example, and then we have exons, introns, and so on. And if we want to identify from here what will be the actual coding sequence, that part that will be translated into a protein, it's very hard to specify all the rules in detail for a program to find this. There are many different combinations, and we don't even know all the possibilities or have a good way of specifying them. However, we have many examples from known genes, because we can sequence, for example, messenger RNA, and then find where in the genome those parts, those sequences are, and so we can label genomes for which we studied the RNA where the genes are, and then we can use those as examples and give them to the computer with the appropriate algorithms to, instead of saying how something is solved, we are just giving examples of solutions of the type that we want. And this is done with increasing success in recent years using deep learning, for example, artificial neural networks. But in bioinformatics, for example, hidden Markov models have been used for many years now. And the idea here is that we have an algorithm that can build an approximate model, using those statistical regularities in the data and so on. And this model is itself computable. So it's also an algorithm. For example, an artificial neural network is a sequence of multiplications, additions, and some functions that we apply, but it is all specified. The computer can execute it and do all the computations. So it is an algorithm. The only drawback is that when we look at that, we see a million different algebraic operations, and we don't really understand how that works. But we have this possibility by using many examples to train those models and generate an algorithm that we can use, for example, to identify the coding sequences in new genomes, even though the algorithm is a bit messy and we don't understand very well how it works. So these are examples of different types of problems and different approaches to generate the algorithms that we want. But across all of these, there is also one practical concern, which is the efficiency of the algorithm. Basically, how long it takes and how much memory it requires. This performance, the time it takes, is important because we need to use the algorithm. If we implement the algorithm and we conclude that it takes 10 million years to give us the result, then that's really not useful. We are not going to use that algorithm. So when we are considering algorithms to solve particular problems, we also need to think of how the algorithm is working in a way that guarantees that we'll have a useful algorithm in the end. Let's see two examples for solving this simple problem of sorting a series of numbers. One simple algorithm is, I'm sorry, this is a typo here. It's selection sort, not insertion sort. Selection sort takes, looks at all the different values in the array and finds the smallest value. So in this case, by looking at all the values at the first iteration, it finds the 0 and puts the 0 on the first place, exchanging with the value there. So in the first case, it's an 8 that starts there, but this one finds the 0 and puts the 0 there. Then it does the same for the smallest element of the remaining, which is 1, and then the smallest of the remaining, which is 2, and so on. So basically, for each element in our set, selection sort needs to go through all the set of values and then to find the smallest one and then put it on the first place, and then it needs to repeat that for all the remaining values. So this is actually the number of steps will be the square of the number of elements, because it's all of them for each of them, n times n, divided by 2 because it shrinks by 1 each time we are doing this. But this is proportional to the square of the number of steps. A different sorting algorithm is Quicksort, which takes one of the values, for example, the last one, and now puts all of those that are greater on one side and those that are smaller on the other side. And then it repeats the same procedure for each of the two parts. And then it repeats again and so on. The advantage of this is that when we are considering one of these parts, we only need to look inside the part that we are sorting. because all the values are already separated on one side and the other. The result of this is that for each element, we don't need to look at all the other elements. We need only to look at around the logarithm of the number of the elements that we want. So on average, this is proportional to n log n in the number of steps. Now, this can make a big difference, because if we have a set of values that is 10 times larger, then something that is proportional to the square of the number of elements will take 100 times longer. If it's n log n, in this case of Quicksort, it will only take 23 times longer. If it's 100 times larger, then in this case, with this quadratic time complexity, it takes 10,000 times longer, but with n log n, it takes 460 times longer. So you can imagine that as the number of elements on the arrays we want to sort increases, the difference between using a selection sort, this is again incorrect, it should be selection, the difference between using selection sort and quicksort increases as the set increases. So at some point it can become unfeasible to use selection sort, and we need a more efficient algorithm. So this is just a simple illustration, but in general we will have to consider this. We will have to consider whether we can solve the problem in some useful time frame for the kind of data that we're using. And one example where we're going to see this occurring is when we are considering the alignment of two sequences, where we can use some algorithms that can guarantee we have the optimum alignment under the matching scores that we use. But when we are trying to search, for example, databases of millions of sequences, we cannot use the same algorithms, because now they take too long to execute. Another thing that is important is not only the steps that we take, but also how we organize data. We're going to see more examples of this in detail during the course, but just to give you an idea, I'm going to use a less computer science problem, and a problem that we all are familiar with. Suppose that we labeled each address, so each house, each shop, each apartment, with just a number. We put them all in sequence. For example, as new houses were built, we would assign them different numbers. And our data structure, where we would have all the addresses, would be a large map of Portugal, where we have all the numbers corresponding to all the houses, all the apartments, all the stores, and so on. So if a friend told us that they lived at house 3,487,112, for example, to find out where our friend lived, we would have to look at the map and go through all the map, all the millions of little numbers, until we found where our friend's house was. So this would obviously not be very practical when we have millions of houses, apartments, and so on. It's much better to have a data structure that looks like a tree, where we have different levels. And in this case, this is what we use for addresses. We can have the district, the postal code, and then the street, the house number, or the house block, and so on, the floor, the apartment, and so on. So this is much better, because at each level, instead of trying to search through millions of possibilities, at each level of the tree, we only have a small set of possibilities. So it's easy if we know our friend lives, for example, in the Lisbon district. Even if we don't know where that is in the map, we can easily find by looking at the names of the districts, because there are not that many. And then inside that, we can look at the postcode and look at the regions and so forth. So this way, we have it's much easier to have an efficient algorithm to find the address than if we use a different data structure, where we just have all the millions of houses in a long list, and we have to search through every one of them, for example, in the map. So this is just to give you an idea that the way we store our data is very important to determine the efficiency of the algorithm, which in turn will also determine if the algorithm can be used or cannot be used at all. So to sum up, we saw what an algorithm is. So the basic idea is that it's the specification for a procedure such that even a computer can follow. So doesn't require any ability to decide, to think, to understand the objective or something like that. This causes some difficulties and requires some practice because we are used to explaining and specifying procedures to other humans that understand what we want. So that simplifies a lot what we need to specify. When we are trying to talk to a computer, we need to specify every single detail, and this can lead to quite messy results if we are not careful. So those kinds of skills of decomposition, abstraction, pattern recognition, and so on are very useful in order to enable us to specify, to find the correct algorithms and implement them in the computer. In some cases, the algorithm may not be exactly what we want. This now depends on the problem, but remember that the computational model that we are creating is under tighter constraints than the scientific model. Because scientifically, we can talk about different protein sequences having different regions that are conserved because they come from common ancestors and were under selection pressure not to change and things like that. But then when we try to compute that to represent, for example, the alignment of those sequences and to find how to align them, we meet this problem that computationally it may be very hard to optimize the alignment of many sequences simultaneously. We don't have information about the evolution of those sequences. We can only look at the sequences as they are right now and so on. So all of these additional constraints force us sometimes to implement something that is not exactly what we want, but try to get the best approximation under these limitations. And in some cases, we may not even have an idea of how to solve the problem. And so we can use those generic approaches of machine learning where the computer itself will generate an algorithm that approximates what we want based on the examples that we give it. By the end of the semester, we will take a look at those types of algorithms, although in a very brief way in this course. We also looked at efficiency and related to these data structures because if we want to actually use the results the computer gives us, we need to be able to run the algorithms in a useful amount of time. So it's not merely a matter of deciding what things must be done, but doing them in a way that the computer can give us the result in a reasonable time frame. Okay, so that's it for today. We will talk during this week about questions you may have. So see you all on Wednesday. Bye.